Hello, friends. Good afternoon. I'm so glad to see so many of you here. Welcome to Central Synagogue at lunchtime. I'm Rabbi Sarah Berman. I'm the Director of Jewish Culture and Programming here at Central. I know almost everybody here, but just in case, that's who I am. Today, the week following International Women's Day, we are honored to be hearing for the first time at Central from the Israel Women's Network. Our guests today are in New York because of the UN Commission on the Status of Women, a global conversation about what women are doing, what women can be doing, and how our world will support women's ambitions and status in our society. Our speakers today are Professor Daphna Hacker. She's the chairwoman of Israel Women's Network, and she's a prominent Israeli feminist leader. A longtime activist, she has pursued a successful academic career as a lawyer at Israel Women's Network, and later became a board member, which is what she still is. In 2022, she was elected by 115 countries to serve for 4 years as an expert member of the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Professor Hacker is a full professor at the Law Faculty and the Women and Gender Studies program at Tel Aviv University. Her research has focused on the intersection of law, families, and gender, and she has been published in 3 books and prestigious Israeli and international legal and socio-legal journals. Our other speaker today is Maya Shokan. She's the Director of International Relations at the Israel Women's Network. Between 2021 and 2024, she worked as a welfare correspondent, a news program editor, and a producer at IDF Radio. During her coverage of welfare and employment issues at the station, she focused on reporting on women's rights, care for people and children with disabilities, and assistance for the elderly. We welcome Dr. Hacker and Maya Shokan.
So, hello everybody. We are really honored and thrilled to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the organization. I just was at the synagogue. I always heard about this wonderful synagogue, and to see it with my own eyes is really a privilege, and now I understand how wonderful and rare it is. And it's an honor to be part of an event and a group of the most important, in my eyes, the most important stream within Judaism, the one that really upholds gender equality as part of its very core values. So we will start with a very brief presentation, and it will be followed by Q&As. Some are prepared, and some will arrive and come from you, because I think the questions and answer is the best part. So we'll start. I will just give a very broad overview. Much of it you already know, but to give some context for the more detailed information that Maya will provide regarding what we're doing at the Israel Women's Network. So the Israel Women's Network is the most, I think, important, if I may say so, lobby organization in Israel. We are celebrating our 40 years anniversary this year. So we've been around and we've seen a lot. And we are specializing in policy making and whatever that includes. So our main pillars are lobby in the Knesset, in the government, legal action, mainly petition to the Supreme Court, and media coverage, really educating the public about what it is that women in Israel need. So we are looking at thematic issues that concern all women in Israel. We are apolitical. We strive to represent all women, whoever they are, whatever community they belong to, and we've been doing that for 40 years. So these are just examples of cases, for example, that we took to the Supreme Court. So Alice Miller, I hope many of you heard, she was the woman with whom we petitioned the Supreme Court to open the pilot course of the IDF for women. And ever since, women are integral part of the IDF, also in combat roles, and we all know what a prominent role they have played in October 7. And of course, we can go on about that. Orit Goren was a very important court decision that says that women have the right to equal pay for equal work. Very basic, and it's amazing what a long struggle Orit with IWN had to go through just to secure her very basic right for equal right. Chen Ohana is a more recent case of what we call now in Israel hadarat nashim, women's exclusion, women who are not allowed, for example, in this case, to use public transportation just because what they are wearing. In this case, this was an ambulance in COVID-19, and the ambulance driver did not allow her to be taken to the hospital because she wasn't modest enough. So these are the kinds of issues we are now dealing in Israel. We also added 2 pictures of public campaigns we are holding from time to time. Again, you see this man picture. It's out of hundreds of women's pictures. Again, I don't know if you heard of it. We have a horrible phenomena in Israel in which public advertising with women's faces are being painted on in black by Haredi men who don't want to see women in the public sphere. So this was a campaign, you know, it looks like a man, but it's actually hundreds and hundreds of pictures of women. Again, another campaign about, there was a whole, every year there's a commotion of the length of shorts girls are allowed to wear in schools. Again, this is our reality in Israel. So we've been working on gender equality again for years, and now, and we've already mentioned the UN, and I'm also a part of the UN Committee for promoting women all over the world. We are asking ourselves the questions: are we going back? What are the current challenges and threats? We thought in the past that this is going to be a linear process. We're gonna fight, but it's going to be better and better and better. And all of a sudden, we are realizing that we cannot take for granted any achievement that we have already accomplished. So in Israel, lack of political representation. We have dropped many, many places in the international indexes of gender equality because of lack of representation. The pay gap, we have the biggest pay gap in developed countries, but South Korea. They're worse than us. This is not a comfort. But women on average in Israel earn 30% less than men. Gender segregation, which I've already mentioned, and gender-based violence, which we will elaborate in relation to the war. So these are the indexes. So even before the war started in October 7, we dropped 23 places in 2023. This is really a bad achievement. And you can see here an example of the protest that we already had before the war. And then October 7 erupted. I was told that you are very educated about what's going on in Israel since October 7. So really just a reminder of what it is that we are talking about. So Gaza, of course, is the major front. But we have to understand that we are really dealing with multi-fronts conflict in the north. Also, and this is, you have to understand, this is something that Israel has never experienced before. Never did we have terrorists for hours and hours in private houses and in military camps. Never in our history did we have hostages, hundreds of them, being taken away to Gaza. Never did we have thousands and thousands of Israelis being evacuated from their own homes for months and months. And never in our history did we have women playing such a major role in combat units and reserves. So again, this is a new horrible period for us. And I don't know if you knew about the Houthis before October 7. I didn't know about the Houthis in Yemen. And it was amazing how much we had to learn. Who are these guys and why do they hate us so much? And I think we're going to talk about today about the parallels between Israel and the US, but in so many places in the world, we are just perceived together. So the hatred for both US and Israel is manifested in these guys, really, that shouldn't have anything to do with us and are throwing missiles hundreds and hundreds of miles from us. And all the challenges that Maya is going to detail now, you have to bear in mind that women are not around the decision-making tables. So this is one of the things that it's our role to keep on asking, what about women in these horrid times? So I'm passing it to Maya.
Thank you. Good. Great. So, as Daphna said, we are severely lacked of representation of women in Israel. There's only one CEO of government ministry out of 29, which is insane, and we have only one woman in the National Security Council, which is now deciding every aspect of the war. I'm going to keep this up. But although that, we've been everywhere since October 7th. We've been in combating units. We've been in all kind of units in the army. I was 5 months in reserves in the beginning of the war. We've been in a Knesset fighting for the return of the hostages. We've been outside fighting for our rights and fighting for ceasefire, for every kind of situation that we've been dealing with. And through it all, we understood that women carry the burden of war, and it's a different kind of burden than men carry. Men still mostly goes to the army for combative war. They have a very, very high burden in their hands, but women carry a different kind of burden, and a burden that is usually overlooked by the decision-making personnel that obviously don't involve a lot of women. So we know at the beginning, as Daphna mentioned, the education system shut down. There are a lot of evacuees everywhere, and women really had to maintain family life every day to day. And we know that during war, there are a lot of guns that are being distributed to people who are going to fight the battle. There have been changes in policy during the war to increase people that can get firearms. So it's become insane in the street. There are so many firearms, and women are not protected in their homes. And that's, we understood immediately that that's going to lead to a rise in domestic violence. We conducted this survey just a few months ago to show that the fact that there are partners that are fighting in the war can cause a rise in domestic violence. We see that when neither of the partners are in reserves or fighting the war, there is only 3% in domestic violence. But when we have two partners, it becomes 24%, 8 times more than neither of them. So we know that there is a major effect to the war on domestic violence. So as I'm concluding all that, we understood that we needed to change and to add to our services that we give using the hotlines that we using for 40 years. We created Women's Rights Center named after our founder, Alice Shalvey, and as the center works, it has a hotline dedicated only for women who are affected by war. So we get calls from all kinds of women with all kinds of issues, and we help them navigate through what their benefits supposed to be, how the government can support them. We're trying to be the middleman between their need, middlewomen. Apologies. From their needs to the authorities, but also sometimes we can see that there are some issues that are coming back and back from multiple women, and then we understand that there is a problem in the system, that there is a law that isn't written for women's needs. And then we go back to our policy department that Daphna shared. We do a lot of lobby work in the Knesset, and then we can say to the policymaker, here you have a problem in the law. You have a problem in the law, we need to change that so women will exercise their rights completely. And that's what we do. We find macro level issues through the line, and we go to the Knesset and fight for women's rights there, so women will never be overlooked. Another project that we started during the war, and it's my personal project, so I'm very excited to share it with you. We established an international department. It was very important to us. We saw how important it is to have connections, international connections. We heard the denial of what happened on October 7th, especially what happened to women, and we decided that we needed to be more involved in this arena. So we have two main goals. We want first to create a network of organizations, feminist organizations worldwide, that we connect with, that we collaborate with on similar issues as the feminist movement worldwide experience a backlash. We're going backwards in various different countries, and in Israel as well, and we want to learn together and discuss strategies that can work in different countries as we fight the same issues. We also, our second goal is to work more closely with the UN. The Israel Women's Network is one of two feminist organizations in Israel that has consultative status with the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. So that gives us a lot of perks. We can write a lot of inputs, and we can share a lot of our work and data with the UN bodies, and that way we can affect change. I mean, for instance, for the Commission on the Status of Women that Rabbi Berman discussed that we are here, we submitted with few more Jewish women's organizations a statement that called for an international protocol to be implemented on standardizing response to conflict-related sexual violence, because Israel, unfortunately, known in the past war and conflict, but didn't know how to handle good enough when it came to CRSV. So we want to create a network of organizations that understand the needs to combat conflict-related sexual violence and work together to make sure that the world and every country knows how to respond to those horrible crimes. And together with those two goals, we want to really fight the backlash, as I mentioned, as we see in Israel. I'm sure we'll discuss this further in the questions, but we see that there are new rules and new laws that are being worked on now in the Knesset that will take us back, that will limit our opportunities, and we know that we have to fight them, and that's one of our goals in the international department, to know and to learn strategies from the world how to do that in Israel. And just on a happy note, we want to add with some victories that we had recently. We had a historic Supreme Court ruling just 2 weeks ago, I think. We petitioned on the fact that there is only one CEO of government ministries out of 30. And we got, the petition was accepted. They accepted our claim that it's not legal to continue like this. We have a law that we must have adequate representation of women in government, key government positions, and now we are working hard to make sure it's going to be implemented. We also had a very important success in a case of ultra-Orthodox women who were denied their rights, their labor rights for years. Almost 2,000 women, we won them 7 million shekels. And now, hopefully, this system will stop, will give them the benefits that they deserve. And another victory from the Alice line that I just explained about is the maternity pay for women reservists. There was a flaw in the law that said that women who, that we discovered that women who were pregnant during their reserves and didn't work prior couldn't get their benefits, their allowance, the birth allowance. In Israel, there is a birth allowance, and they were denied that right because reserves wasn't count as deployment for some reason, even though it's a very, very difficult job to be reservists for so many months. And we changed that law to make sure that all pregnant women and women that gave birth during or after the reserves will have their money that they deserve. So this is us. And we now can continue to our next part.
Hey, grab the microphone. Thank you very much. We can give them a round of applause. They did a really nice presentation. I'd like to welcome you to come and join and sit with me. So for those who don't know, my name is Michal Abramov, and I'm the Shlicha, the Upper East Side Israeli emissary, working here at Central Synagogue. And I am very excited to continue your presentation and ask you some more questions and maybe get a bit more information, and then hopefully get some questions from the audience as well. I'm sure we all have a bunch of questions. I wrote down like a million things while you guys were speaking. But to start us off, I would like to hear, this is something we like to do here at Central, is to get to know you guys a bit more personally. And maybe if you could start by each sharing, how did you find the Israeli Women's Network? How did you end up working there? What personally moved you to join this campaign? And then we'll dive more into the work. So
I'll start. Okay, is that working? Yeah. As Rabbi Berman said, I was a welfare correspondent in the Army radio station, and the Israel Women's Network were one of my sources, really. I had good connections with them. We had a lot of coverage together on women's rights in Israel, and so when my time to finish the Army came along, then they offered me a different job that I'm doing right now. I was supposed to help expand our lobbying department, but I was supposed to be released from the Army on the 9th of October 2023, so I stayed for 5 more months, and they were so kind in waiting for me. And they had a new role, which I embraced. I think it's much better fit for me, and I'm so excited to continue the work that we've started.
My story with the Israel Women's Network is a quarter of a century old. When I finished law school, I didn't like it. And then by chance, I saw a brochure of the of the New Israel Fund, which I hope many of you are familiar with. And they had for many years a program in which they sent 2 young lawyers to Washington, D.C. to become human rights lawyers. And I said, if I'm going to be a lawyer, it's going to be a human rights lawyer. And then we had interviews, and 2 other guys were selected. But they were very impressed, so they decided to look for a special grant for me. And I was very fortunate that the person, Kathleen Paradis, I don't know if you heard of her, she's a very famous New York lawyer. She said, I will fund her in Washington under the condition that she will specialize in women's rights. And that was after a degree that I did in Hebrew University, in which I wanted to hear more about women's rights. And I asked my professor, and they couldn't provide an answer because Israel was so far behind in feminist jurisprudence. So I went to the States. I lived for a year. I did my LLM. I excelled. Because for a change, I had such a good time, unlike in my LLB studies. And then the second year, the New Israel Fund scholarship was a year they paid the salary in an Israeli human rights organization. And I chose the Israel Women's Network. And then I did that for 2 years, and then I realized that being a lawyer is really not for me. And I went back to academia. I did a PhD in sociology because in the States, I realized that my passion is not about the law on the books, but law in action. How law really affects people. And ever since, that is what I'm doing. I'm a sociologist of the law. I'm a legal scholar with the sociology background. I'm doing both. And my position in the university is split, which is very rare. I'm 50% law, 50% gender studies. And I'm very, very fortunate. And then the year passed, and I heard that the Israel Women's Network is in trouble, that there is a crisis in funding, that it's... and we've decided, a group of important feminists, to save the Israel Women's Network. And that was about 9 years ago. And there were elections, and we were elected to the board, and we revived this crucial organization. And we dedicated this effort because we cannot imagine Israel without the Israel Women's Network. We have to have a strong feminist lobby. There's no other option. So whatever it takes, we're there. And then I stepped down because I was the head of the gender studies program. I thought there might be a conflict of interest. I want to be there as an academic for all feminist organizations. And then came what some call in Israel the reform, legal,
Judicial reform.
the judicial reform. And I felt that this is a time of crisis. And then came the war. And then, well, I don't have to tell you. So I've decided that although I'm a full professor and although I'm part of the UN, which means 3 times a year in Geneva for 3 or 4 weeks, you can imagine the overload, I have to step up and accept the offer to be the chair. So since August, I'm the chair of the Israel Women's Network, and I'm really my perspective is that this is a time of crisis. And we all have to do whatever we can to save democracy, to save women's rights, to save our achievements. So we're not only just about pushing forward, we're about preventing the backlash. So that's how I'm back here.
Wow. Yeah.
We're very
Thank you
fortunate.
so much for both for sharing. And I think that's it's so interesting to see how both of you come from sort of different worlds and different backgrounds and how you ended up doing similar work and similar understanding. I think it's also very what was missing from your story, because we can see it, you're both women, right? This is a very personal issue, but not all of us have your abilities and your opportunities. I do want to, because we're going to talk a lot about October 7th, and we're going to talk a lot about women at wartime, because that was a lot of what is currently happening in Israel. But I do want to sort of, before we go into that, talk a bit about the Israeli Women's Network before October 7th and women's rights before October 7th, because we do see a lot of those issues sort of resurfacing and coming up again before October 7th. But maybe you can help us, because you kind of touched it in the presentation, but maybe if you can sort of highlight the top 3 women's issues that were facing Israeli society before October 7th.
So I'll talk about one, and I mentioned women's exclusion. And I think I'm a family law professor. That's my field. And in Israel, we have a law already from 1951, just after the state was established, that is titled Women's Equality Law. And it was one of the first in the world. And you know, we have this equality myth in Israel. Israel was one of the first nations that really put forward women's rights. And we had Golda Meir, and we had women in kibbutzim, and we had women in IDF. We have a lot to be proud of. And when we open the law books, the Israeli law books, it looks pretty well. I'll give you another example. For example, sexual harassment. Australia and Israel were the first in the world to have anti-sexual harassment law. And our Me Too started several years before the global Me Too. We already had an NGO that collected stories from women and then anonymously put them on virtuals. We had it all. At the same time, within this women's equality law from 1951, we have Article 5. And Article 5 says this promise of legal equality for women does not apply to family law. It says so. How come Israel cannot guarantee equality in family law? How come when Israel ratified CEDAW, my convention, the committee that I'm on, it placed reservation to Article 16 of the convention that promises equality in family law. How come? Because Israel never had and still does not have civil marriage and divorce. So we are governed by religious law on marriage and divorce. We are governed by religious courts. Even if I'm married in Cyprus, civilly, if I want to divorce, I have to go to a rabbinical court. And you know that there are no reform rabbis on the rabbinical court, right? So we are governed by Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox in my field of research. So I've known that Israel was never a full democracy in that respect. So what happens now is that this norm, the ultra-Orthodox norms, are trickling down to more and more spheres. So all of a sudden, we have buses in which women are requested to sit at the back. I mean, how can that even be? And that's a fact. And it went all the way to Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says, oh, that's really bad. But if it's voluntary, we cannot interfere. Okay? And because I'm a sociologist, I've been reading demography for years now. And on average, ultra-Orthodox women in Israel have 7 children. Secular Israeli women have 2. So the joke now in Israel, it's a joke, it's a non-joke, is that the future secular children are going to come from the ultra-Orthodox. How come? Because the rate of those who will leave the ultra-Orthodoxy going to be higher than the birth rate of secular women. I'm saying all that to say that there are root causes to what it is that we see today. And I think the good news is that now everybody knows. If 15 years ago I told liberals, you have to start to think about yourselves as a minority. Otherwise, you will not do what is needed to save Israeli democracy. Now I don't have to convince the liberals. They know. So now the question remains, what it is that we're going to do to save the democracy of Israel and maybe even make it better.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you starting with a positive. For those who take my class on Wednesday mornings, we were also talking about the World Zionist Congress and how women had the right to vote and be elected from the first World Zionist Congress in 1897. So it's really nice to see that Israel does have that similarity, but also highlighting our challenges of being a Jewish and democratic state and what happens when a certain sector controls Jewish. So thank you for bringing that up. I do want to bring us, since we don't have a lot of time, I do want to bring us closer to October 7th. And I want to kind of focus I have here a bunch of questions about October 7th, but I think sort of top of mind for all of us is the question of the hostages and the question of sexual violence. And I was hoping if you can maybe give us a bit more information about that, maybe some of the information that you know, some of the things that the Israel Women's Network is doing, and just I know it's something that is all in all of our minds.
So in regard to the sexual violence, we do have reports of sexual violence being perpetrated in Hamas's captivity. We obviously don't share a lot of those information to protect the hostages that returned, thankfully. And we are still hoping for the return of all the hostages that are still in Gaza. We are doing a lot of work on accountability for the conflict, the sexual violence that took place on October 7th. It's been a very harsh work. We've been trying to bring the UN to investigate the crimes of Hamas because on the last report, the UN did not add Hamas to the blacklist of organizations that do use sexual violence as a weapon of war. We are trying to bring them back. They are willing to come back and to conduct the full investigation that they need in order to add Hamas to the blacklist. We are getting some the Israeli government is making a bit of problems. They don't want the UN investigation to enter Israel. So that's a struggle that we've been facing. I know I see your faces. It doesn't really make sense. The first report that the UN organized was a good report. I mean, they stated that there was sexual violence, that there was rape during October 7th, which was important to us because this is how you have accountability nowadays where there's no enough forensic evidence. But now we need to have a more in-depth investigation, and this is the current struggle that we're facing.
Can you say maybe an extra word about the committee and the UN? I think in general, one of the especially here in the States, when we talk about October 7th and we talk about the hostages, is where are the international communities? Like, where is the UN? Where is the Red Cross? Where is this? And you're kind of shedding, and we kind of spoke about it before, that there is a bit of resistance from the Israeli government. And I will also say, for those who, again, maybe are not aware of also the Israeli government's resistance of doing a national commission of inquiry on October 7th, right? There is some sort of resistance in the Israeli government on
to check what happened.
To check what happened. So if you can maybe elaborate more about the international organizations, because we're all asking about it.
Yes, so the UN has a special office on conflict-related sexual violence, and the woman who is heading this this office, Pramila Patten, is very open to coming back. She went first for an fact-finding mission, as they call it, for 2 weeks at the beginning of January 2024, and she conducted an investigation, a smaller scale investigation without a lot of communication with the Israeli authorities. She didn't get enough information to have enough to write about in the report and add Hamas to the blacklist. We see that also in reports by Human Rights Watch, another big human rights organization worldwide that is researching about those situation. They published their report a few months ago, again, saying that there was conflict-related sexual violence on October 7th, and they did that without any communication and evidence that the Israeli government gathered. They gathered everything by themselves. So the Israeli government doesn't give anything to those investigations. They don't cooperate, they don't work with them. And we find that interesting. I mean, it's an issue because we want to have an international accountability. We are astonished by the fact that there is so much denial on what happened on October 7th. But on the other side, we know that we are closing off a bit. Like Israel is closing off our borders for the international community to really understand what happened. And it's problematic.
If I can add, I think that we realized the importance of civil society in Israel after October 7th like we never did before. The government was just not there for us. So NGOs saved Israel after October 7th. And it's amazing that even on an issue of sex-based violence during the war, the government was not there. So I want you to understand that the state did not collect forensic evidence.
And we asked during that time if they're doing that.
And because of, according to Jewish law, you have to bury the dead very quickly. So that was kind of the practice. Nobody was prepared. There was no protocol. There was no procedure. There was complete chaos. And even after that, those who conducted the investigations were the New York Times. Why did we have to wait for the New York Times to figure out what happened? Feminist NGOs, and Pramila Patten, who arrived from the UN. So Israeli women are now deserted in a way on both ends, both from some of the UN organizations that did not believe Jewish Israeli women just because they're Jewish Israeli women, but also from our own government that has not yet published a formal report on what has happened. So we have a government with an interest that we will never know. And our role as civil society now is to speak truth to power. And we need a lot of resources, we need a lot of persistence, and this is our role. So it's on many fronts, including this one, unfortunately.
Thank you. And I think that brings me back to a point you made that I also wanted to ask you about, which is the lack of representation of women in decision-making roles, right? You kind of spoke about it as before of the war, and especially now during the war, there's no women in the cabinet who are deciding about, like, what is the relationship with that? And I think also in general, I'm going to add an extra question because you mentioned civil society. One of the sort of the opposites that we're seeing in the civil society, in the sort of awakening of the protests, in the voices that have been happening even before October 7th, a lot of the leaders are women, right? So how do we find those parallels, and how do we sort of take this civil action of women leading protests and actually move women into decision-making roles?
Yeah, the biggest leader of the last protest was Shikma Bressler. She's a woman. She's an amazing woman. She's a doctorate in physics, I think, and she has 5 kids. Professor in physics, sorry. And she's just an amazing woman who just decided that she can't.
She led the judicial reform protest
Yes.
before October 7th.
Shikma.
Shikma Bressler.
Bressler, yes. And decision-making table before October 7th, there was a big barrier as the fact that there are two parties that don't allow women to participate at all. They're closed off to women. So we have 2 parties that are just not an option. And we have conservative parties as well there are less women there. And now in the current government, we see a decrease in every possible role in this government, that there is less and less women. And the women that are there most of the time take roles that are not as important or not as funded or not as relevant to women's situation or to the civil situation at all.
I'll say more than that. I think that we have learned in recent years. I remember when I was a young lawyer at the Israel Women's Network, Pnina Rosenblum, who was a model, I don't know if you ever heard of her, she wanted to become a Knesset member. I remember the debates we had. Should we support Pnina Rosenblum? Although she's a model, as she's not really a feminist, but she's a woman and we need women. I think now we are smarter. And I argue that we have to fight for women as women because women are half the population and they are human beings and they deserve the right to equality no matter what they think. But because resources are scarce and because we are facing the backlash, our battle should really be for feminist women around the decision table maker. You know, I don't need an anti-feminist around the decision-making table, even if she's female. I'm sorry, this does not comfort me, maybe on the contrary.
No, there is a good example now of women that introduce laws that are just anti-feminist. Like segregation in the academia now is a new law that we're trying to fight.
The only women's lobby in parliament now is the lobby for the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox women. That's the name of the group of Knesset members who are fighting for women, right? So this is not the answer. And I will tell you the mirror. I'm looking for men as allies now like I've never done before. We cannot afford this segregation in which we only talk with women, we only approach women. We need men as allies. And we need them to take a stand. We need them to open doors. We need them as philanthropists. I don't know if there's a new report set now that shows that women's causes philanthropy is 2% of the overall global philanthropy. And in Israel, it's less than 2%. And men still own 2/3 of the global wealth. So even, for this practical reason, but more substantially, I think liberal men now understand that women's rights are their rights. They want it for themselves. They want to be free to choose whatever, story of their life they want to write, and they want it for their daughters, etc. So I'm looking for the values now, more than for the, sex.
No, thank you. That's a really good point. We don't have a lot more time, but I do want to take us to maybe a broader scope, because you kind of mentioned it in your presentation, and I think here in the United States, we definitely feel it, sort of this global movement away from the achievements of women's rights, what you called the backlash, and how do we fight it together. I would love to hear more about your work on the global sphere of connecting with, especially what's happening here in the United States when it has to do with women's rights, and just in general, how, even though Israel is in war and is dealing with a lot of other issues, how are we still this global partner in doing this work?
Yeah, so first of all, we have an interesting collaboration now in Israel with the LGBTQ community and a research center that we're trying to learn on the anti-feminist movement in Israel, a very conservative movement, you can call it, in Israel, and try to understand how to build strategies to defend from going backwards through those work. We see them in the Knesset. I mean, we see the results. We see the rules, the laws that are being presented nowadays, and we see that there is more and more laws that are being there to push women aside or limit our opportunities, and we're trying to work together because the LGBTQ community sees that too. So we are conducting a research to understand how to better tackle those issues. We are also here in the CSW to learn from different countries and different organizations how they're doing that. I mean, I was in an event with Poland women activists from the women's strike in Poland, that they've succeeded. I mean, they had an horrid government that wanted to restrict reproductive rights and so many women's issues that would have been going backwards because of them. And they succeeded. They marched like 6 million people, I think they took to the street, and they changed the demographics completely. So we want to learn from them. How did they do that? And that's one of the reasons that it was so important for us to be here to participate in this event, because there's so many countries, and the US, one of the biggest, that experience this backlash. And we need to know how to work together, but how to also learn from each other and to tackle this, because it's just unbelievable. It's really unbelievable.
So in the UN now, the discussion is what can be done. And there's a lot about alliances. How do we share knowledge, resources, how we work together, how we add up to big numbers. There's a lot of talk about how we fight fake news. How do we produce reliable knowledge? And I can tell you that as chair, I'm preoccupied by translating this knowledge to really simple messages that everybody can hear and everybody can learn. And I want to address women, again, whichever community she belongs to. So you just had an example of the work that we're doing for ultra-Orthodox women. So ultra-Orthodox women should understand that we are there for them as well. Or Palestinian women. Polygamy in the south of Israel is an issue for all of us. So I'm doing research in academia, but how do I translate that to simple messages, so Bedouin women will know that I'm there for them. I think for too long, feminist organizations have been doing incredible work without getting the credit from the audience that they've been serving, and this has to change. Philanthropy has to change. Women in Israel have to understand that they cannot wait for anyone to save them. They have to become engaged in gender lens giving, in echoing our messages, in becoming part of us. In a sense, I'm thinking about how to do lobby in an era in which lobby is really hard.
Yeah.
So we are thinking about, for example, experts communities. So we are having a legal community. I want to also have media community and politicians community. Women who already hold power, but need to translate their power to struggles for all women. So if I can, group them and provide them with our messages and show them that there is a way to translate frustration into action, this is going to be the new lobby. Yeah. And I think it's true for Israel, and it's true for other places.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you. I just want to highlight a few things that you also said in your presentation, because I wrote this down. I wrote that you are an apolitical organization looking for thematic issues affecting all women. But what you just said, and I do want to highlight that for all of us, is that you also address particular issues, right? Because we do know, especially in Israel, it's a very diverse community, ultra-Orthodox women are facing different issues than Bedouin women, than Palestinian women, all who are Israeli citizens or under Israeli law. So I love that you sort of shared that of how do we represent particular issues of women's as an all general issue of women and promoting women. Before we end, we only have a few more minutes left, so I do want to make sure that we open up to questions from the audience. Marina has a microphone, so you can raise your hand, and she'll come to you.
Hi, I'm Vicky. That was very informative. I don't know, it's a little bit sensitive, but after October 7th, of course, what was going around in the United States, at least with people that I knew, was this "Me Too unless you're a Jew" statement. And I had read, frankly, I can't sort of read much anymore, but I've read just not very much about what exactly happened to the women. And I'm just curious if any women that survived are going to come out and actually do a documentary, speak about exactly the horrible, horrific details, because there's so much denial about it. If anything like that is going to happen, or the burials that what people witnessed when they were, it's a horrible subject to bring up, but it seems to me that the world sort of focuses on morbid. that they'll listen to or look at or watch. They may not want to believe it, but that they'll pay attention to it. And so I just was wondering if there's any kind of a
I'll tell you
outreach
that maybe not as the chair of the Israel Women's Network, but as a researcher, a feminist researcher. I think we should not play into the hands of populism. We have to talk very responsibly, very sensitively, very accurately about this very, very sensitive issue. And already in November 2023, I published a column in the media with the title, "We Will Never Know." We will never know exactly what happened. I told you that forensic evidence was not collected, and most women who were abused were also murdered. And those women who survived, and we know that there are women who survived, they have a right to privacy. They have a right to tell their story when they are ready. So there was a time in which the newspaper published that the Israeli government is asking hospitals to provide them with private information of women who were hospitalized. This can never be, right? It has to come from them. That's one thing. The second thing is that I think we are playing into the hands of conservatives when we are only talking about sexual violence. People were burnt alive. Families were murdered together. Men were abused in captivity in worse ways than women. We should talk about the atrocities as a whole. We should not surrender to this war pornography. So we should insist it had happened. We know there was sexual violence, but it doesn't matter exactly what happened to whom when. What matters is that hundreds of terrorists, without borders, without moral, without limits, with hatred, entered Israel and did what they did. And the problem is now that what we see is that hate gives birth to more hate. And there are waves of hate in Israel in which we must somehow contain. Otherwise, we are all doomed. So again, don't play to the hands of populism. Know what we can know, admit what it is that we cannot know, and talk about the bigger picture, which was horrible in itself, and not portray women again as the sole victims. Because if we are only victims, we can be nothing else. And I welcome the discursive change within feminism from victims to survivors. So some were murdered, and we should talk about the loss of life. And those who survived will survive on their own terms.
Thank you very much. So my question is, why is Israel so reluctant to share information or cooperate with the NGOs or the UN in terms of gathering evidence of the sexual violence that was committed?
So what we understand from the UN and from our sources in the government is that Pramila, the one that I was speaking about, the one who is responsible on conflict-related sexual violence at the UN, they're conducting their investigations on both sides. So they will conduct the investigation on the 7th of October, and they still want to visit the prisons and see the allegations of Palestinians of abuse and sexual violence in the prisons and in detention centers. And Israel is reluctant to agree to that. The thing is, and that's I think it's the most unfortunate thing, is that the UN has access to those Palestinians and to those allegations. They're already investigating those claims. So we are just like standing there without saying our piece and showing that we are investigating some of those claims. And this is not a policy, and this is not something that is supposed to be done in the prisons, but we're not there. So that for me, I think it's a very
I'll
worrying.
give you another example because it's so complicated to understand what's going on. The Red Cross. Why the Israel government is not shouting on every stage, why has not the Red Cross visited the hostages in Gaza? Why? Because Israel does not allow the Red Cross to visit the prisoners in Israel. That's the answer. So instead of being Or Lagoim, saying we are more moral than that, and although we face the most horrid atrocities, we will obey to international law. Sadly, the Israeli government does not obey international law. So it cannot call for the enforcement of an international law for our causes.
Yeah.
So this is the complex and very, very disturbing story.
Yeah, now I think our biggest fear is that Israel will enter the blacklist of the UN and not Hamas.
And this is not to say that the UN is neutral or objective.
No.
The UN has been against Israel for many, many years. And when you count the numbers of discussions on Israel in the UN, it's disproportional to anything. We just had in my committee a mission from the Democratic Republic of Congo. I don't know if you know what's going on in Congo now. Hundreds of women are being raped, murdered, horrid. Do you hear about that? Maybe. Well, can you compare it to what you know about the tiny Israel of the... So this is not to say that we are dealing with an objective, and there is anti-Semitism, there is bias, there is political pressure in the UN, but we cannot forsake this fear. And this is what the Israeli Women's Network is trying to do. We're not naive. We're not going there, oh, this is a lovely place. No, this is a hard place to be Jewish. This is a hard place to be Israeli, but we insist. And we insist to hold the Israeli government accountable to international law because we have no better plan for the world. International law is the outcome of the Holocaust. International law was established to prevent a third world war. We should not forsake that mission, not in the name of anything.
Yeah. And I want to add to that an example of a case study that is happening now. The situation in Ukraine. Pramila Patin's office is investigating crimes that was committed by Russian soldiers in Ukraine, but also investigating crimes that were committed by Ukraine soldiers. And Ukraine is still opening the borders, is still allowing Pramila's team to investigate. She writes that she sees crimes from both sides, but the crimes on the Ukrainian side is being investigated, and they're just benefiting from the situation. So I think that's an example of how a country can decide to open its borders to the international arena to ratify conventions that they didn't do before, or an example of how closing up the borders and closing everything. Now we see in the CSW there are so many events on what's happening in Gaza and to women in Gaza, but there is no event of the Israeli delegation. They didn't participate, and we see the unfortunate results of this policy.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. If I can volunteer your time a little bit more. I know there were a few more audience questions, so if you're okay.
And you have these
Yes.
these names. Just write down your email, your name. We'll send you our newsletters. We're not harassing every week. Don't worry. You have the reports, 2 of our reports, the blue one and the red one, so you can see how we are insisting on evidence-based policy.
Yes.
And these are 2 examples of the way we do it.
So I do want to leave us off as you're gathering thank you so much for bringing the information. If you can leave us out, we like to end with a little bit of hope. So maybe something that, what gives you hope during this time? What of your work, what of your personal life gives you hope in your work and what you do?
So, first of all, coming to an event like this, saying that I'm from Israel and not getting any, for now, I don't know, you have experienced something else, any back shoulders. I mean, everyone is very welcoming to the conversation, to what we experience. It's very interesting to people that I'm meeting, and I think that's very hopeful. And I take a lot from that, and they're open to collaborations, and it's amazing. Another hopeful thing that I can share is that we have built such a strong connection with the Jewish women's organizations, especially in the US, and it's such an amazing bond that we share that I'm so proud of, and we're working to expand that, and we're trying to create a community of Jewish organizations, Jewish women and men that are interested in those issues and are interested to advocate for a better future for women. So it's very heartwarming for me to create those connections and hopefully to expand them soon.
What gives me hope is the wonderful women of Israel. It's unbelievable the number of women who dedicated their lives currently to saving the country. And they're doing it in so many ways. And they are inspiring, and they are strong, and they know they want to stay in Israel and have their families stay in Israel. And they are our friends and our colleagues, and because we are so many, and because we are so wonderful, we have no choice but to succeed.
Yeah.
Thank you. Really, what an honor to have 2 amazing Israeli women doing amazing work. Thank you all. I want to thank Marina and the entire adult education team for putting this together, our AV team, our security team. Thank you all very, very much for being here. Thank you both of you
so much
for being
it
here.
Was a
Have
pleasure.
a wonderful rest of your day. And please stay tuned. We have a lot more speakers coming in from Israel, including a partner of the Israeli Women's Network, Orly Erez Lochovsky from the Iraq will be here on March 28th and will tell us a bit more about the work that we're doing together. We also have an organization called the IGI, which is the Israeli LGBTQ organization. We'll also be here on March 31st for Trans Day of Visibility. Come and hear their perspectives in general. It's Women's History Month. It's International Women's Day. We want to make sure that we also talk about wonderful Israeli women. So thank you both for being here. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.
I can't exactly explain it, but